Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. In fact, the final Sharks player review, where we will be discussing goaltender Kaapo Kahkonen, and what this means is that he was, in my opinion, the most disappointing player for the San Jose Sharks this season. Now, similar to his goaltending partner, he does not have much history, in fact, even less so than James Reimer, acquired at the trade deadline last year in exchange for Jacob Middleton from the Minnesota Wild, and played a few games for the San Jose Sharks at that point. And honestly, during that 10-game stretch that he had, he actually looked pretty decent, even though he only won 2 of those 10 games. That is primarily because of the fact that the Sharks were really bad at the end of the 21-22 season. If you actually take a look at Kahkonen's statistics, his goals against average was below 3, and more importantly, his save percentage was a .916. And so it was a pretty strong sample size for a goaltender on a very bad team, which likely gave Mike Grier, who came into the team with Kaapo Kahkonen already on the squad, it likely gave him hope, because Grier had a pretty important decision to make this past offseason. The Sharks had 3 goaltenders on the roster: Kahkonen, Reimer, and of course, Adin Hill. And the question was, which of these 3 goaltenders would the Sharks end up getting rid of? It was unlikely to be Kahkonen because they had just so recently acquired him from that trade deadline deal. And so the question was whether it would be Reimer or Adin Hill. Personally, I thought it should be Reimer, not only because he is the older of the 2 goaltenders, but also it seemed as though he would probably have the most value, considering the fact that Reimer had done the best that past season. But instead, the Sharks decided to move on from Adin Hill, perhaps to try and keep a veteran presence, perhaps to actually try and have a good goaltender for next season, because like I said, Reimer did do the best in 21-22. But of course, we do know how that ended up working out. The Sharks traded Adin Hill to the Vegas Golden Knights, and the rest is pretty much history at this point. But let's not focus on that. Let's instead focus on the fact that the Sharks went in with a tandem of 1A, 1B, and Kahkonen ended up being more so the 1B in that setup, and it was not a good season at all for Kahkonen. He started 37 games and won just 9 of them. That means he won less than 1 in every 4 games, slightly less than that, but still. So that is a lower than 25% winning percentage. That is just genuinely terrible. His goals against average was a 3.85. That is close to a 4.0, and he is not a college student. He is an NHL goaltender, so that is exceptionally bad, good, or bad enough, I should say, for 4th last in the league out of goaltenders who played at least 25 games. And his save percentage is .883. Again, exceptionally bad, and once again 4th last in terms of all goaltenders in the league who played at least 4 games. This was just an awful look for Kahkonen, and even though once again those same types of caveats exist for Kahkonen, the fact that the Sharks' defense in front of him was relatively unremarkable, and we know Erik Karlsson is much more offensive compared to defensive, and he's on the ice most of the time. But at the end of the day, you are expected to put up at least a half-decent performance if you are a goaltender on a really bad team. And you can see that across the league with goaltenders like Alex Stalock on the Chicago Blackhawks or Vejmelka on the Arizona Coyotes. Kahkonen was just not that at all. And what's worst about it actually comes with his more advanced stats. So when we were talking about James Reimer in the previous video, I talked about how far his low-danger save percentage had fallen from last season to this season. And it felt as though it was a lack of focus from James Reimer, that was his biggest issue this past season, where he just didn't really seem to be involved in the games. When it comes to Kaapo Kahkonen, a similar drop, and in fact a larger drop, existed from his low danger save percentage. It went down from a .977, which last year was good enough for 2nd place in the entire league, down to a .962, which has him in the bottom 10. And his medium danger save percentage is a .825, which is league worst, meaning he is the worst goaltender when it comes to facing off against these medium danger chances. And for those who may not know what a medium danger chance is, these are usually the ones that are not necessarily expected to go in, but ones that are definitely a step above, an unscreened shot from the point. Ones that are like, maybe from in close at the face-off dot, still unscreened, but a very good shooting position. Things of that nature. Around 20% of shots are expected to be medium danger, and Kahkonen was letting in a ton of of them compared to other goaltenders around the league. And so if you take a look at these two statistics together, the fact is that even if his high danger save percentage isn't terrible, because it's not, the fact is that you only face off against around 5-ish%, at least according to where these stats are taken from. About 5% of shots in a game will be considered high danger, which means most of the time you're facing off against lower and medium danger chances, and Kahkonen is one of the worst, if not the worst, goaltenders in the entire league at saving those two things combined. Which tells me this is not a focus issue like it may have been with James Reimer, but maybe a fundamental issue with Kahkonen's game. His statistics prior to this season, they were pretty solid, I guess you could say, during that 10-game stretch with the Sharks. But prior to that, the Minnesota Wild, the Wild are expected and usually are a team with a very solid defense in front of their goaltender and a pretty solid defensive system in front of their goaltenders. And so they frequently make their goalies look a lot better than they actually are. And Kahkonen's statistics were always pretty middling even on a team like that with the Minnesota Wild. So coming over to San Jose, it wasn't necessarily expected to be easier for him. It was expected to be much harder for him, and he has not rose to that challenge. His statistics, like I've said multiple times, are just extremely bad for a goaltender. And so when it comes to last season's grade, I of course did not have a grade for him because he only played 10 games, but I did have a mid-season grade for him, which was an F, which in my entire career of grading players, I had never given a single F grade because I felt as though you would have to be so bad to be able to get an F, which of course stands for failure, and yet Kahkonen managed to do that at the halfway mark, and over the last half of the season, the last 41 games, he did pretty much nothing to be able to change my mind from that idea. And so the fact is that once again, I am giving him the grade of an F, and the only reason it feels as though he is still with the San Jose Sharks is because he just so happens to have 1 year left on his contract. Mike Grier has been so ruthless with how he has been just dropping players left and right, especially the players who he himself did not bring in, that if there were an end of a contract, even if it was an RFA type of situation with Kahkonen, he almost certainly would not be back. And I think also the fact that Kahkonen was so bad this past season plays a role in why Mike Grier decided to go out and spend a 6th-round pick just to acquire the rights of Mackenzie Blackwood instead of just going for a random veteran goaltender in free agency, because at this point, he has likely lost a lot of hope in Kaapo Kahkonen and actually being a goaltender for the future. This is not a Martin Jones type of situation like the Sharks had back in 2015-2016, where they had that deal, that 3-way trade with the Bruins and Kings to get Martin Jones, and he ended up becoming the Sharks' next starter. It feels as though Kahkonen did not run with that chance, and while there is not a 0% chance that he's able to come back next season and actually do well in 23-24, the odds are definitely very, very low with the fact that we've been hearing multiple stories about him having to rebuild his game entirely. So it is essentially a situation where we're kind of hoping Blackwood can take over from a Sharks perspective, and if not, they will once again have a really, really bad goaltending tandem, if not the worst in the league. Class dismissed.